Good morning, everyone. This is Stefan Underwood from Continuous Improvement. We'll get started here in a few minutes. As usual, we'll put a few minute delay on just to let people who are running in after coaching a class, give them a chance to get in, get settled, get logged on. We're still seeing the attendees number going up. But just a couple quick housekeeping notes. Today, we will be talking about energy system development and like a true applied version. My goal is to give you new information beyond XFS and XPS on how to apply the system. Housekeeping note, please don't email Hannah McElwain. We use her account, which we appreciate. But if you have any questions or issues, please email continuousimprovement@teamexos.com. Or we've also got Colin off screen, and Colin is monitoring the chat box. So as always, please type your questions into that chat box, and he'll throw live questions to me at the end. We'll make sure we have time for conversation. But other than that, give us just a couple minutes. We will turn the cameras off for a moment. Then come back on in a few minutes and we will get rolling. Good morning. Let's talk applied energy systems development. I'm really excited about this because it is a topic that I personally really like. And I've been wanting to give a presentation like this for a while. To be honest with you, I completely created an all new presentation for this presentation. I'm not recycling slides. I'm not regurgitating XFS, XPS, because if I listen to comments from the field, I think it's one area we've actually been weak on as a company historically is we have a phenomenal system for how we look at ESD, but we haven't helped people connect the dots. So I don't want to just say more about what's on our pre-existing materials. I'm going to have a few slides up front to recap it, but other than that, everything should be new today. But if you want to go back and review those materials, please do. XFS, XPS, we have some ESD, Exos Presents in conjunction with Intel and data that are pretty good to listen to. So if ESD is an area you want to get stronger in, there are resources out there, but hopefully this gives you a bunch of new stuff to work off of. That's the goal. So even though, because we're in this setting, we couldn't do an applied practical, as much as I wanted to have Colin sweating his ass off on a treadmill and be talking about it while we're watching. Obviously, this one doesn't play to a practical as well as, say, kettlebells last year did. But I'm still going to try and make it applied. Throughout, I've got seated slides with practical examples of actual workouts. And we will take this slide deck and attach it afterwards. So you'll have the access to download these slides and be able to review them for yourself and look through the examples. There's 4 things we are going to cover today. Okay, the first is we are going to go through an ESD recap, literally just a handful of slides, but make sure we're level set on what we cover in XFS, XPS, and what some of the key takeaways are from that. Then the next 3, points 2, 3, and 4 are all ways to progress ESD. So we aren't just looking at what is a green zone workout, but how do I actually build a program and grow from week to week to week to week to week and progress through in that example, green zones. And there's a few different ways to look at progressions. So we're going to talk about how I progress the intervals. We're going to talk about using pace versus resistance to achieve your watts, and we're going to talk about introduction of impact. So let's get into that recap. I'm not going to go too fast, but I'm also not going to go slowly because I really want to make sure there's time at the end for questions. I imagine there are a lot out there. Please put them in the chat box. Colin Young is off camera. He's going to be looking at them. I would love it if we had time at the end for a good bilateral conversation, an opportunity to really unpack how to fit our ESD system into your settings. So let's talk about that recap. The first thing we see there is Krebs cycle. And there's a point to say we need to simplify. You don't need to know every step of the Krebs cycle in order to be able to condition someone. Now, having an academic background, sure, it's advantageous. I'm not trying to diminish that. But what I'm saying is, think of yourself as a coach. If I come in to see you and I want to get a little bit bigger, I'm looking for a hypertrophy-based program. I'd like to gain some lean mass. I imagine everyone watching right now could help me achieve that. But if I then said, academically, can you please recount every step of the energetic theory of muscle hypertrophy, we probably have a smaller number that can do that, and that's okay. My point is, if you don't need to know every step of the energetic theory of muscle hypertrophy to help someone get bigger, I don't need to right now be able to recount every step of the Krebs cycle to be able to understand how to increase someone's metabolic infrastructure. And so we want to simplify the message. And at the end of the day, the only key takeaway that we need to know is it based on intensity and duration. Yellow zone is a long duration, low intensity. We typically use that for recovery and endurance. Green zone is moderate duration with moderate intensity. We use that to train at or slightly above threshold. And then red zone is low duration with a high maximal intensity. And that's used to train at maximum capability. That's all we need to take away from there. And we can put those on what we call the speed power profile. So if we look at this, it is a lot like being parallel to the force velocity curve in the weight room. Same as we want to surf the whole curve in the force velocity curve. Move some heavy things slow, move some light things fast, and everything in between. Various loads at various speeds, if you recall how we define our approach within in things like XPS and XFS. Well, now we're saying here's the speed power profile. Over to the left, you've got your maximal power output over a very short duration. The example there is 10 seconds. Think of a 100-meter sprint, okay? And that's pretty high power output. That's our red zone, low duration, high intensity. That very quickly slides down. As we then pull out to the middle of that green zone, you see it says 15 minutes. Think of a world-class a good 5K, okay? But we're talking about that middle distance now, middle duration. That's moderate intensity, moderate duration. And as we slide down even more, and there's less of a drop off here, then we start talking about anything from 30 minutes all the way up to 2 to 3 hours and beyond. And if you think about it, as we look at power output and pacing strategies, that's the way it works. There's a significant drop off in your pace from sprinting 100 meters down to running a 5K. There's not a huge drop off in your pace going from a 5K to a 10K to a marathon. It degrades a little bit, but not as drastically. So we just need to understand intensity and duration gives us these three areas or separate zones that, sure, they become muddled a little bit, but we see red zones, green zones, and yellow zones. And the key here is we want to see that variance across the week. The name of the game here, just like force velocity curve in the weight room and surfing the whole curve, the name of the game here is to surf the entire curve. So we aren't looking to have every ESD the same. And this is something that I often see when I'm talking with field staff, where we'll get down to that final block of ESD, and every day from a metabolic standpoint is the same. Sure, there's different exercises present. Sure, there is variety. But when it comes to what I'm doing metabolically, every day is the exact same. And that would leave us short. It leaves a gap. It leaves money on the table, just like if in the weight room, every day is the same. Because once I've adapted to it, if I'm not pushing myself to adapt further, then I am left sort of hung out to dry a little bit because I'll still be sweating. It's still hard work, but I'm like a hamster on a wheel. I'm just going around. I'm not actually adapting to something. So this is just a few examples. Obviously, you have way more than those three options, but it's just a few examples of how to structure your week. There's not a right or a wrong amount to do each, but the idea is that you have an exposure to each zone or balance. And if you get down to that option C, where there's only 2 days a week with ESD, then we'll take the two higher intensity days, the red and the green, and pull out the yellow. But again, look at what an individual's goals are, learn what they need, design, and deliver. And in that, you're going to create your calendar to figure out what you're going to have day by day, but you should have an exposure to different zones and variety through the week. And the last thing we need to recap is just looking at general guidelines here. And I'm not going to read off this entire chart, and this is from other education we have. This is one slide I did repurpose, but you can look over it again, download it later. But the key here is don't get hung up on only work to rest ratios or sprint length. Because if you actually look, 30 on, 30 off, a 30-second work rate with a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio fits in yellow zone. It also would fit all the way down there, 1-to-1, and 30 on, 30 off would be a fitness red zone, the other end of the table. So we have the exact same work to rest ratios and work length, sprint length, and we're calling one red zone, one yellow zone. What makes the difference? It's that bottom column. It's getting into understanding the output you want, the intensity and duration, and the total session length. Because think about it. If I tell you right now, we're about to do 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off for 4 rounds. It's 4 minutes. Then I'm going to give you 2 full minutes of rest. Then we're going to do 4 more and we're done. That's it. Leave it all on the table. That's pretty intense. And that's a total of 10 minutes. Now, if I said, all right, guys, come on in, we got 30 on, 30 off, constant, nonstop. We're just going to let that clock run, and we're doing that for 30 minutes. You're going to have a self-pacing strategy. When we talk about that later, those workouts aren't equally intense. You're not going to come with the same intensity on that first 30 seconds, knowing you've got 29 more, as you would on the one where you know you've only got 8, and you really only have to get through 4 before you get more rest. So you're looking at the combination of work to rest ratio, sprint length or work length, and total session length, and then an understanding of the intensity you want to see, and that's how you work within the parameters that are given here. So that's our recap. Let's get into how we create programs and how we progress things. And we're going to start with progressing the intervals. And this is something that I feel like a lot of coaches, when I talk with them, it's something that is a conversation that is not currently being had. There are a lot of coaches that really are meticulous in their program design in the weight room. And they'll look at sets and reps and how they progress those week by week and what the total volume looks like. And they're accounting for all of that. But when we get to ESD, again, like I said, at the end, we just sort of see the same thing every day. And my take-home message here is we should have the same progression. So if I look here, here's an example. And each of these rows is a week or a phase. You don't have to progress every single week. But let's say this is a true red zone. And let's say I'm on equipment base here. Let's say I'm on a VersaClimber. I'm going to look at 8 seconds on, right? 52 seconds off, just because I like easy math. So again, it goes to show within this falls within the ranges on that table we saw a couple slides ago, but there are a couple examples that just a little bit squeak outside the range, and that's okay, because they're just guidelines. But there's also something to be said for ease as a coach, and working at the top of a minute, we go for our next set. So if I've got 8 on, 52 off, I do that 8 times. Maybe the next week I progress that and it's 8 on, 52 off, and I do 10 times, then 12 times. Now I can start playing with work to rest ratios and sprint length. 10 on, 50 off times 8, the next week times 10, the next week times 12. I'm progressing. Then 12 on, 48 off times 8, 10, and 12. And working through, and you see here, we've got 8, 10, 12, 15, 4 different work rates. Okay, 3 of each. We've got 12 weeks of programming here for your red zone day that every Monday we hit and we have a progression. And we're talking about then moving into finally 15 on, 45 off times 8 times 10 times 12. But there's something more, not only saying let's progress, start quantifying things. Because if I now look at my total amount of work, that's the key here. Look at how it progresses and you'll start recognizing a certain sort of undulating shape that is progressive overload. So we start 8 seconds on for 8 rounds. I do a total of 64 seconds of work within that 8 minutes. And we work on. Then I go up to 80, then I go up to 96, okay? And I continue to progress. But as I then go 10 by 8, I drop back down, 10 seconds now, but 8 rounds. I drop back down, okay, to 80. 10 seconds on for 10 rounds, 100 seconds of work, times 12, 120 seconds of work. So I build up. Then I drop back down. 12 seconds on, 48 off for 8 minutes is 96 seconds. So we see this undulation allowing for an adaptation, okay? The main thing here is we have applicability to classes as well. So this is a very clear model if I'm personal training someone and I want to drive adaptation. But it's not completely lost on me if I'm in a class environment, because I can have different groups of capabilities, 2 groups, 3 groups, whatever it may be. But I can start saying, okay, here we go. We're going to have these 2 groups. Group A, you're in the advanced group. Group B, you're newer. I want you here. Both of these workouts are going to have a start call at the top of every minute, lasting for 8 minutes. But one group is going to be told to stop at 8 seconds. The other group is going to be told to stop each set at 12 seconds. That means going from 64 to 96, the group that did the 12 on, 48 off in that 8 minutes did 150% of the work as the group that was only on the 8 on, 52 off. So I can still apply these concepts of progression. Maybe not as clear where every week I progress for every individual, but I can have sort of 2 or 3 different groups. And as I see fit based on people's consistency to my class, I can move them into different groups. And as they see that progression, that's motivating. And we now start building that long-term client, okay? So another example here, both of these workouts take 10 minutes, but there's different work done. The other thing to call out, if I do have time, if I'm looking at long-term progression, or if you're working in a system where you're really trying to get someone to peak for something. So let's say someone has signed up for an event and they want to peak. We don't want to just always go up in the volume. If we think of our classic periodization, we see our volume go up at first and intensity go up in foundation. Then very quickly, as we continue through that program, we want to see our volume go down while our intensity goes up. So a key point here is that I can go down this ladder. I can also work back up it. Nothing says 15 on, 45 off times 12 is automatically the hardest thing on there. It's all about having an adaptation that you seek. So if they've worked up in that volume and you now work them back down that ladder, when they get all the way back to a simple 8 seconds on, 52 seconds off, and doing that for 8 rounds, a low volume, that intensity should have gone up from the first time they ever did that workout. So now if you're collecting metrics and you're writing down that, let's say on that Versa climber, the total feet they climbed, okay, or that curved treadmill, the total distance they ran, whatever it is, you quantify what they've done. When you get back to that workout, you should see them do more in that amount of time, and you can show them the progression they've made. So it isn't a one-way arrow. We can go down the ladder or back up. And it is our basic principle of overload. Okay, this is the key element here. We want to track volume to demonstrate progression. We've all seen this wave-like undulating curve of progressive overload. We should see it in our ESD as well, and we should see that we are tracking volume and intensity and doing things to either amplify volume and decrease intensity, or amplify intensity and decrease volume. And that interplay between the two lines is periodization. So I know that everyone on here sits in different settings. Some are working in class environments, some are personal training. There's a whole slew of differences. Some have set start and end dates to programs. Others have a drop-in system where you might have someone that's been with you for 2 years and also in the same class get someone that's their first day. It's okay. I'm going to give you as many examples as possible and show how they can be manipulated for your environments. Like that last one of saying maybe it's not a clean progression, but I have 2 or 3 groups going that I move people through. But I'm going to throughout this give some real world practically applied ideas to take home or drive home a point. And the first point is overload and progression of intervals. If it doesn't work though, hopefully you can, for you in your setting, hopefully you can take away some concepts and apply it to your world. So let's look at this first workout. So this is a red zone, okay, progression. This is only 1 day of the week. This is just your red zone programming. And we've got 3 phases each 3 weeks here. And what you can see here is that I'm applying that last table. Now, not every stop on the table, but I'm applying that last table in general. And I'm progressing through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And so what we're talking about here is I'm going to start on a treadmill, because I assume a lot of you guys might not have Versa climbers, so I don't want to keep using that as my example. It tends to be my favorite piece of equipment, but I don't want to keep using that as the example. But everyone has treadmills, or a lot of people should. So if we've got a treadmill, and let's start at a 10 incline and a high speed, okay? Week 1, they're doing 10 seconds on, 50 seconds off times 10. Week 2, it's 10 on, 50 off times 12. Week 3, it's 12 on, 48 off times 10. Okay. You see, as I go into phase 2, I now take that treadmill. I want to try and really get it moving faster. I drop to a 5 incline and I bump the speed. But we still continue to progress up in volume a little bit. 12 on, 48 off times 12, to 15 on, 45 off times 10, to 15 on, 45 off times 12. Then phase 3, so we've taken that low volume, lower intensity in phase 1 relative to red zone. Okay, it's still high intensity because it's a red zone, but lower intensity relative to red zone. We've gone up in both higher volume and higher intensity in phase 2. Then as we go into phase 3, you see that we drop right back down to have our lowest volume at our highest intensity. So the treadmill drops to a 1 incline at a maximal sprint speed. And you'll see we're doing 12 each week, but instead of doing 12 in a row, it's now 3 sets of 4 with a 2-minute rest after each 4th one, just to help them maintain the intensity. Because again, it's about power output. It's about that intensity. So I don't want the peripheral fatigue to step in and not allow me to run at a speed that achieves the intensity I'm looking for. And you see we go 12 on, 48 off, then 10 on, 50 off, then actually back to 8 on, 52 off. And if we look at the math, as I purely just look at the amount of work across those weeks, it goes like this. If we call all 9 weeks, it goes 100 seconds. To week 2 is 120 seconds. Week 3 is still 120 seconds, but at a different density, which we're going to talk about later. Week 4 is 144 seconds. Week 5 is 150 seconds. Week 6 is 180 seconds of work. And then for week 7, 8, and 9, we start going back down. 144 120, then finally 96. So my lowest volume is in week 9, but it should come at my highest intensity. And that's the key that we want to remember. So now let's look at green zones. How do I show the same idea of progressing intervals for green zones? Well, same thing. I can start working through, for example, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, times 4 rounds. I can then do that times 5 rounds. Then I can start increasing the density, which I'm going to start talking about more now coming up, which is the amount of work done, the amount of time, like total, the amount of work in that total time that you are spent, the amount of times that you spent working. Sorry, that was a mouthful for me. So we go then 2 minutes on, 1 minute off times 5, 2 minutes on, 1 minute off times 6. So if we look at that, that 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off times 5, okay, that is 4 minutes total, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off per round, times 5 is 20 minutes of work. And in that 20 minutes of work, you are doing 10 minutes worth of work. So you have 50% of your time at intensity, okay, or 50% density. If we now look for another one that is, let's go down to that 2 minutes on, 1 minute off times 6. Well, now I'm not doing 20 minutes anymore. I'm only doing 18 minutes. But in that 18 minutes, I'm doing 12 minutes of total work. Therefore, 12 minutes of my total 18 are spent at high intensity. So you're starting to calculate time spent at desired intensity. And by defining that as then a percentage of the total session length, you can sort of put a number to your density, right? So 12 minutes out of 18 minutes working is the 66, is 2/3 density, 66% density. Whereas that first example I gave you of 2 on, 2 off was 50%. So we have an increase in density even though the total session length went down 2 minutes. So we just see this progression, 2 on, 2 off, 2 on, 1 off, 3 on, 2 off, 3 on, 1 off, 4 on, 2 off, 4 on, 1 off. And again, I'm looking at the total amount of work done in each of those programs. This one dips after every 4th week, but you still see what that looks like as a curve. And again, I can still have different groups. And in this scenario, both of these workouts are going to take 20 minutes. Both are 5 minutes per round, either 3 + 2 or 4 + 1 for 4 rounds. So both of these workouts are 20-minute sessions. But I've got group A working for 3 on and getting 2 minutes of rest. I've got group B working for 4 minutes on, 1 minute of rest. Meaning there's a total difference in density taking place in that time and a different progression for those people who have been with me longer that are in the 4 on, 1 off group. And again, I can go both down and up this ladder. So as I get back to that 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, I better be working at a faster pace than I originally was. So density is the amount of work done within a specified amount of time. And that's your key take-home point on this one, is considered density. 2 on, 2 off times 8 is 8 minutes of work inside 16-minute time span. 3 on, 1 off times 4 is 12 minutes of work inside a 16-minute time span. There is 150% more work going on in the second example than the first one because of increased density. So progress your density and you find a way to stay within timed sets, even in a group setting in a class, by differentiating people into groups. And you still find a way to provide progression through density while still watching the clock that you're accountable to get people out on time. So our practical applied here, I wanted to bring the idea of a circuit. Now look, you don't have to take these exercises or go do this circuit exactly. I basically picked 6 exercises. I picked based on movement patterns. So I picked a squat, which is a lower body push, push-ups, which are an upper body push, leg curls, which are a lower body pull, and a TRX row, which is an upper body pull. Plank with arm lift is rotational stability. Jump rope is going to be metabolic and an introduction to impact. That's all I did there. It's that simple, right? So I just picked my movement pattern and picked these. Now, let's say you've got a class, you come in. Initially, when people start coming to that class, I'm going to have them go through 3 different circuits. So I just pair 2 exercises. So circuit 1, circuit 2, circuit 3. I can have different people. If I've got a large class, I can say, hey, you guys are on circuit 1 to start, you guys are on circuit 2 to start, you guys are on circuit 3. Order is not important here. But what I've got is 3 different circuits where I go 45 seconds on, 15 seconds off, resting 1 minute, and repeating that 3 times through each circuit. Then they'd go to the next circuit. And they just go back, you know, group 1 on circuit 1 is going A, B, rest a minute, A, B, rest a minute, A, B, rest, go on to circuit 2. Okay. In the phase 2, all I've done is kept those same movements, and you could change for variety, sure. I was just trying to keep the example clear. But you take the movements you want to see in your class, and now I've got groups of 3. I've got a 3 exercise circuit. So I set up my classroom a little bit differently. I've got equipment laid out a little differently. I've only got circuit 1, circuit 2. I stay 45 on, 15 off, rest a minute through each of those 3 things back to back to back. And I do 2 times through each circuit. Then in phase 3, it's 1 big circuit, a round robin. I just need to have enough stations to account for the number of people I've got. If I've got 18 in my class, I make sure I've got 3 sets of kettlebells, 3 mats for push-ups, 3 jump ropes at each station, so on and so forth. And now we're doing 1 big circuit with those 6 exercises. I'm going to change the times here a little bit though. I'm going 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off, resting a minute after each, and doing 5 times through that class. And with it being a shorter interval, I ask for more speed, more intensity. Try and get more push-ups in. Do your push-ups at a faster pace. Okay. Now let's look at some math there. I ran the math on that. Phase 1 is a 27-minute workout, and 18 minutes are spent working. So it's 66.67% density. Phase 2, by restructuring, going to 2 circuits instead of 3, 2 circuits of 3 as opposed to 3 circuits of 2. I've got 24 minutes total, so a little bit less, 3 minutes shorter on my class, but I was trying to keep them all that sort of 25 to 30 minute range, right, of where I might be in a class after doing some pillar prep, movement prep, run through my class and want to have time for some regen at the end. So I stayed at that 30-minute or lower mark, but it's actually 3 minutes less, 24 minutes, but there's still 18 minutes of work. So phase 1 to phase 2 is actually the exact same amount of work, 18 minutes, but one is achieved in 3 minutes less total session time, which takes your density from 66% up to 75%. Then we go to that big circuit, phase 3, that mega circuit. That's a total of 4 minutes and 15 seconds per circuit round, going through it. We're doing that 5 times. My total session is going to last me just over 26 minutes, 26 minutes and 15 seconds. And 21 minutes and 15 seconds is spent working. That's an 81% density. So I'm not just randomly smashing things up or providing variety for variety's sake. I'm providing variety, but I'm able to quantify and show how people who stay with me for a long time, working from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, increase their density. And look, if someone joins in phase 3, that's okay. They're going to have a self-pacing strategy. They're going to self-regulate. That's fine. But if I just start running through these 3 phases, but changing up exercises, each time we get back to phase 1, those that have now stayed with me for a while, they execute phase 1 at a higher intensity. So I can continue to work through this idea of a lower density to a higher density, a new program. And by actually starting to consider this, we start getting a clear picture of ESD. I know you're all running fantastic classes out there that are circuit-based bootcamp style classes at times where we've got exercises and circuits. What I want to propose is you consider how you structure those circuits and define the amount of time spent working, the amount of time spent resting, and then the total amount of work in the total session, and quantify your density. And now you have an opportunity for progression with your clients while having a fun, engaging, movement-based boot camp. Okay, so we go from low density to high density. Next up is yellow zone. That's a pretty easy one. Yellow zone is traditionally used by us for recovery, regeneration, or endurance. And typically it's not interval based. Typically it's continuous. But if I was going to do interval based, and I only put 3 steps on here as a progression, but you get the idea. I could do anywhere from 30 seconds of work up to 5 minutes of work, and anywhere from a 1-to-1 to a 1-to-2. What I want to call out there on all of your ratios and the numbers back on that table is the 2 work inversely. So if I'm using the low end of the sprint length, 30 seconds as opposed to 5 minutes, then I use the high end of the ratio, 1-to-1, so 30 on, 30 off. Whereas if I go all the way to the other end, I say I'm going to do 5-minute sets. We're going to work for 5 minutes, then rest, and then go to a next thing, then rest, the next thing, then rest. I'm not going to then have 10 minutes of rest. I'm going to go all the way back down to that 2-to-1 and have 2.5 minutes rest. So 5 on, 2.5 minutes rest, 5 on, 2.5 minutes rest. But the point is my total session time is going to at least get over 20 minutes and hopefully get up to that 30-minute mark and beyond. And that's where we get into understanding self-pacing strategies. So even though 30 on, 30 off sounds intense, for 30 rounds, you're going to slow it down and ease off, and you're just going to have that perpetual motion, that lower intensity, and that serves as a great yellow zone. Okay. So the key there is understand people will apply their own individual pacing strategies, okay, and let them. That's how you can apply these concepts to group settings. When I talk, people say, that's great for personal training or an environment where you've got one-on-one with an athlete, but I'm leading a group. I can't just drop someone into phase 3. And the answer is yes, you can, as long as the movements chosen are responsible. As long as there's not a high demand of movement quality required, so we're not using kettlebell swings and a bunch of plyometrics in my HIIT class and asking people to swing kettlebells at a high volume under fatigue when they're brand new and they haven't swung kettlebells before, that poses an injury risk. But if I choose safe, efficacious things, and you saw in my example, everything was lower impact with the exception of the jump rope to introduce a bit of impact, okay? I can drop someone in phase 3 if they show up for the first day and just know they'll take an easier self-pacing strategy. They won't work at the same rate as Joe or Jill down here who's been with me for the last 6 months. And that's okay. But we know that we'll then phase back to 1 where I take Joe or Jill and challenge them to do even more. And I take this new person, give them an opportunity to catch up. So while not perfect, all of this can fit in a class setting. So I just want to encourage you to remember, individual strategies allow you to apply these things in group settings, allow people to have that individuality. Progress your density. More importantly, be quantifying and paying attention to your density, how much work is done in a total amount of time. Okay, and progress your intervals, both down and up, to change intensity and duration. If you can hit those 3 concepts, you are going to take your ESD programming to the next level, and that gives you a week to week to week. So as we put that whole thing into a program, let's say I had Mondays and Thursdays as green zones and Tuesdays and Fridays as red zones, hypothetically. I just take those 2 different examples that I gave you, and on 1 day, on 2 days, you're hitting your red zone progressions, and on 2 other days, you're hitting your green zone progressions. Now, people don't come 4 days a week. That's okay. You try and offer enough solutions or talk to them in a manner where they're maybe just hitting 1 of each in the week. Or if they just hit 1, that's okay. It's still better than doing nothing. We aren't looking for the perfect solution, but we're not letting our issues with accounting for large groups and people coming in and ending programs at all different times, we're not allowing that to be an excuse for not considering progression or considering these things. And that's the challenge to us, is we want to be better for the people that we serve. Now, outside of progressing my intervals, I've got a couple other quick short points, and we're setting up well on time management to be able to answer some questions. So please be typing questions to Colin Young, because I want to be able to answer them as we go. And we're setting up to have time at the end, which is fantastic. So now I want to talk about pace versus resistance, okay? And anyone who's run on a treadmill and looked at the watts being produced, if you have a Woodway treadmill, knows that I can get the same watts by different variations of incline and speed. So running at a flat treadmill fast versus an inclined treadmill moderate may produce the same number of watts. And I just want to consider that, because I can target watts in different ways. Okay, how do I target a watt? The idea is they provide different adaptations. In XPS, if you've gone through it, this is where we talk about the ability to target specific performance characteristics. And this doesn't have to just be for athletes. This is all people. Let me ask you this. Who's ever had a program that they thought was going to achieve a max heart rate for their client? It was a red zone. It was going to drive that heart rate high. And the heart rate never got there because the person gassed out. Okay. Anyone that plays in the Metcon world, right? So if you enjoy elements of CrossFit or Jim Jones or things like that, you've likely seen this, where you see a program that is designed for one caliber of individual, and they're able to do things quickly and repetitively in a cyclic fashion, and their heart rate goes up. And then you take someone who's a beginner and you try and give them the same program without scaling it, and you see that person, I've seen it everywhere I go, I see that person who is reduced to like 1 pull-up at a time, and then they're bent over. 1 pull-up, right? And they'll tell you that was the best workout ever. But it wasn't really. Their instantaneous power output is in the basement. They're not doing anything. 1 pull-up and resting for a few seconds versus providing an ability to first have the strength before we ask for the pace. So if we put that into an ESD model, I need to build oomph in the engine, to be able to get my legs to move to drive my heart rate centrally higher. Okay. I used to work with military a lot, and they did a lot of long distance stuff, right? They got to go put a ruck on their back and ruck for 18 miles up a hill in Afghanistan at 12,000 feet. Impressive specimens, but they didn't often actually train historically. And again, I'm generalizing here, but most of the guys that came through didn't train in the red zone. They didn't spend much time in these short maximal bursts for power. So their legs weren't used to it. So I'd put them on the Versa Climber. I would tell them we're doing a red zone, and I will have, this was in an education setting. So I will have taught them about max heart rate and red zone driving max heart rate. And inevitably, none of them, we have heart rate monitors on, none of them would achieve max heart rate. And they say, well, that was a 10 out of 10. That's everything I could give you. But my heart rate didn't get to my red zone. Why? Because you didn't have enough oomph in your engine to be able to drive the heart rate high enough. So it gives us this really nice progression. You use resistance-based modalities before going to pace-based modalities. So in a program, I start with things like heavy prowler pushes, but slow, incline treadmill work. You notice in that red zone example, I started incline treadmill, and through the 3 phases, I brought it down. This is what I was doing. I was initially hitting resistance-based, then bringing it to a pace-based. Using mass in a Metcon, so like getting into kettlebell work, whatever it may be, or a high gear on a bike, grinding it out, things that target the legs. Initially in your programming, target watts that way. Then I go to pace-based, and now I've built the leg strength in people to be able to achieve the cardio strength, and this goes higher. And pace-based work would be things like light prowlers, super fast, fast treadmill, a flat treadmill going fast, body weight movements. Start recognizing the difference and be specific in your classes. And again, some people start in an ideal world, if you have the ideal setting, if you're a personal trainer, start with resistance, progress to pace-based, build their leg strength, then go to their cardio strength. But if you're in a class setting, just flip between the two. But people who are there long-term will see these upgrades. But the point is that you are thinking through, what am I using as modality? Am I trying to drive heart rate up through pace? Or am I trying to build leg strength and drive heart rate up through resistance? Okay, it's a key question to ask. So here's our real world applied example here. I'm gonna need 2 prowlers for this. Okay, now I get a lot of you don't have prowlers, but I put this in because it's a personal example. I wrote a program for myself and I went right to what is now weeks 5 and 6. That was my first week. Okay, and I said the idea is this: you're gonna have 2 prowlers, one that is set up heavy, one that is set up light. Okay. If anyone from Powered By is listening, I did this with Paul Caldwell. You can ask him about it. He and I almost died. So you put 2 prowlers on. One is pushing heavy and I'm going to jump right to weeks 5 and 6 here in the example. We pushed one super heavy and slow for a minute, got our legs burning. Then we did repeat light prowler sprints. So it was actually an unweighted prowler. It's just the prowler itself. We'd sprint 30 yards, take about 5 seconds to do it, take 10 seconds rest, turn around, come back. The goal is to do that 8 times, which if you do the math is about 2 minutes worth of total work. So we had about 1 minute of the heavy, 2 minutes of the light, 3 minutes total, then a 2-minute rest. So we're working on 3 on, 2 off. Then we repeated for rounds. Holy smokes, I couldn't get my heart rate up. My legs were trashed. I wouldn't even call my light prowler push a sprint. It was miserable. So we said we need to work backwards here, and we need to first build leg strength. That's when we got to this program. We started off, same setup, but if you look in weeks 1 and 2, the heavy prowler is for 2 minutes constant. Oh man, it was grind. Then the light prowler, the sprint, was just 4 sprints, which was around 1 minute. Think every 15 seconds, right? So it's still 3 minutes on, 2 minutes off. The interval's not progressing through these 6 weeks. What's progressing is resistance-based versus pace-based, the percentages of each. So we did the heavy for 2 minutes, then the light for 4 sprints, 1 minute. Then in weeks 3 and 4, you see the only thing that changes is I now go 90 seconds with the heavy prowler sprint and 6 sprints. So I'm now at about 90 seconds heavy, 90 seconds light. Then after 4 weeks of that, we got back to weeks 5 and 6 and did what originally was not actually that hard of a workout from a heart rate standpoint the first time we did it, because our legs were smoked, we couldn't push hard. We did our heavy prowler push. I felt like my legs couldn't get tired. We were doing it for 1 minute, then 8 repeat intervals. My legs couldn't get tired, but my heart rate went through the roof. This was just a few years back. This was 3 years ago. I'm not giving up my age, but you can guess what my predicted heart rate max should be, and I hit 204 on this. Paul and I were both left on the ground, like could not believe how high our heart rates got, really driving cardio strength. Now, that's an example I use because it's personal, so I can speak to it. I know a lot of you may not have prowlers or turf, or if you do, this isn't good in a large group setting. The point is vary between resistance-based and pace-based. So you see the note down there. I challenge you to do this with your groups on spin bikes and just make the heavy prowler, replace that with a super high gear grind, like all the way to the top where you're absolutely just grinding slow, and then drop to a moderate gear and crank it fast for your sprints. And try the same workout on a bike or on something else like that. And you'll see what I mean about first targeting resistance-based in your programs, then getting them pace-based. This will let you drive your heart rate higher. This will let you get more out of your ESD. And our last thing to consider here is impact, okay? And we want to have a gradual increase to impact. Remember, we are building people up. We're not breaking them down. And it's funny, ESD, we seem to quantify that soapbox moment by negative words. That workout was brutal. I'm wrecked. That smashed me. But if you think about it, we're trying to build people, not tear them down, okay? So we can think about progressions here of eccentric versus concentric and our introduction of impact. We're going to progress from initially concentric only to an inclusion of eccentric load. That maps really nicely to the resistance-based modality I just talked about. If you think about it, I have a decreased eccentric load on my heavy and slow prowler push when compared to sprinting. On my Versa climbers, my incline but slow treadmill, those are things that have a decreased eccentric load with an increased concentric load and increased resistance. We also want to try and remove impact altogether and concentric or eccentric altogether if we can initially for people when they're new to us. This is where I love Versa climbers and bikes and Concept 2 rowers. I've never in my entire career seen a person pull a hamstring on a Versa climber, because there's no impact and it's concentric only and cyclic in nature. Think about the modality you're using. Now that red zone becomes safer, right? And then also consider impact of the modality and begin programs from zero impact. So it begs a question, did plyos belong in ESD? It's funny, the number of places I go where I'm told plyos don't belong in a corporate setting. And it was for a specific reason, therefore plyos were left out of XFS. But just about every HIIT class I observe has a lot of jumping in it because that drives the heart rate up. But we got to look at injury risk and impact. If it's not appropriate to train with plyos for that individual, why am I asking him to jump for 30 seconds straight? So I really want you to consider how you introduce plyos into ESD. And this is my blatant plug for next month, where we'll have Jair Lee from our education team in talking about plyos for Gen Pop, of how they absolutely do apply to general populations, but what his progressions are and what he even calls pre-plyos, and how you can start doing this safely. So please consider eccentric versus concentric and how you progress impact. So here's the real world application. Equipment, okay, on this, in phase one, I did this initially equipment based, then got to movement. So equipment on phase one, equipment based, I get my whole class. We're on the Versa climber, Concept 2 rower, something like that, something cyclic, non-impact. And we just work through our green zone progressions. 2 on, 2 off times 5, 2 on, 1 off times 5, 2 on, 1 off times 6. So I'm seeing a progression of intervals, but all with less eccentric loading and no impact. I then progress them to a treadmill. It's incline, so it's still a little bit reduced. And week 1, 2, 3, I could progressively bring the incline down, to be honest with you. But a treadmill is going to have more impact, because there is impact present, more impact than a Versa climber or rower, but less impact than actually going out, running, jumping, moving, sprinting, cutting. And my green zone intervals continue to progress, just like we talked about at the beginning. 3 on, 2 off times 3, 3 on, 1 off times 4, 3 on, 1 off times 5, week 1, week 2, week 3 of phase 2. Then I get to phase 3, and now it's about movement, and I go to a circuit-based. In this, I put in a leg circuit. Just about every coach I've worked with has some version of a leg circuit. I always heard it originally went back to Vern Gambetta, and he called it the Vern Burn. Name yours what you want. But in this scenario, I just need a box, 12 to 18-inch box for step-ups and jump rope. And I'm going to have people do squats, 20 squats, 10 per leg step-ups, 10 per leg reverse lunges, then 50 quick jump rope. And that's just an example. You can change the number of jump rope you do. Some people do jump squats at the end for like 10 of them. Your goal is to try and complete that under 2 minutes. Okay. Week 1, I ask people to complete the circuit 1 time through in under 2 minutes, rest 2 minutes, and repeat for 5 rounds. So I'm actually sort of back to that 2 on 2 off times 5 that I had week 1, phase 1. But I've now got some impact and some eccentric load and some body weight control and needing to understand posture and space under fatigue. I'm letting people get fit in phases 1 and 2, upgrading metabolic infrastructure to now give them a chance to be successful in phase 3 with the movements. In week 2, you complete the circuit 1 time, rest a minute instead of 2 minutes, and repeat for 5 rounds. So I just cut down rest, so density went up. So this is starting to show you an application of everything we've discussed today. And week 3, I complete the circuit 2 times back to back in under 4 minutes and rest for 2 minutes and repeat for just 2 rounds. Okay. The idea here is put thought to it. And again, remember, individual pacing strategies, if I'm in week 3 of phase 3 and someone shows up to my class, they can still do it. They're just going to move slower and wait till we get back into something that is lower impact. Not perfect, but it can still work. But for those of you that you do have an opportunity to progress people, please consider concentric versus eccentric, low impact versus higher impact. And I don't say high impact, I say higher impact. Okay. So if we put that all together, very essentially, we can just say, take your volume from what is low to higher, but then at the end, remember we said drop volume back intensity, go back up that ladder. So your volume is going to go from low to low in a program across multiple phases. Your intensity is going to go from low to high. Your density is going to go from low to high. Your impact is going to go from low or non-existent to higher, but not high. And again, this is where we'll talk about, do plyos have a place in ESD? And then finally, pace versus resistance. We're going to start with resistance and progress to pace. And if you can start considering not even all 5 of these things, but pick 2 to 3 of these variables and looking at progression through your weeks and cycling through them, and you start quantifying some of these things, I think you will have an upgrade to your ESD for your clients, and you will see progressive overload. You'll see driving your clients to better performance outcomes, and you will see success. That's what I've got. And I'm going to turn off my my screen share here. There we go. And come back up, so it's just me. And it's 10 to the hour, so definitely appreciate you guys sticking around. And while it wasn't applied, I hope I gave enough applied examples and practical examples. But let's see, Colin, do we have any questions?
We have a lot, actually.
Awesome. Let's rattle them off, and we'll do lightning rounds so we get through as many as possible.
Yeah, there were a couple questions surrounding the benefits or where ESD fits in the session, beginning versus the end. I think that's a pretty easy one, as well as breaking up within a movement session. So instead of doing a full strength or full ESD, like the benefits of breaking up, doing half strength, half ESD, without doing a full 20-minute session, can you still get benefits?
Yeah. So if I answer those quickly, where does it fit in a session? Look, traditionally from a safe answer, it fits at the end. But really the answer is, what is your primary goal of what you're trying to do, and prioritize that while you're freshest. But then the other piece has to give. Something's got to give. So if I really, really was worried about conditioning, if I really had to upgrade someone's metabolic infrastructure, I might hit that pillar prep, movement prep, and while they're fresh, go through ESD. But I can't then go put a heavy bar on their back and expect to get them stronger as well. It's got to be more corrective nature, and the strength work needs to be mitigated a little bit or decreased a little bit, because they'll be fatigued. And you know that fatigue will make movement patterns break down. Okay. But again, traditionally, and what we see the most, because we're worrying about mitigating injury risk, while that's the technical answer, typically it belongs at the end because of what I just said. I don't want the fatigue induced on the ESD to make me have poor squat mechanics and put someone at risk for injury. But it's also worth noting, if I've just done strength training, I'm fatigued, again, that brings up, I've got to be aware of what I'm doing in my ESD. If I'm doing a bunch of kettlebell swings and jumping, then I may, again, have a person at a higher risk of injury. So typically at the end, as for the piece of, can you mix things up? Absolutely, you can have fun with it. You know, I always hate talking about strength and ESD as two different things. Our industry is strength and conditioning, and you really can't have one without the other. every single thing you do is it's an expression of strength over a duration of time. Everything we do is intensity and time. Expression of strength over duration of time. 1 rep max bench press is an expression of strength, high, over a duration of time, low. Running a marathon is an expression of strength, although low, over a duration of time, albeit high. So if you want to mix the two together, absolutely we can get away with that. You just want to make sure that you're picking the right movement patterns. And remember, we program around movement splits. Next question.
Next one, when you're picking red zone days or green zone or yellow zone days, does it vary based on what phase you're in, i.e. like a GPP versus a max strength? How might that vary somewhat? And I'm sure that's a pretty deep discussion that we can go into.
Yeah, giving the short answer, it varies on a lot of things. How many times a week am I getting people? What are their primary goals? Yes, their training phase does play in for sure. The answer is, to give that answer, you need to be able to control a lot of variables. And as we talked about, most of you are in settings where you don't have control of all those variables. You might get someone who's new for the first time. But technically speaking, I want to consider what is high neural, okay? What is high intensity? And I want to pair those things up. So if you take your, let's see here. If I take my ESD or my lift here, and I go high intensity, low intensity, and by the days, they do this. People have a tendency to say, my ESD should be offset. So pick an easier ESD zone because I just squatted heavy. So they do low. Then here I had an easier lift, so I can do a hard conditioning session. Then here, offset, and here. The problem is those two lines intersect one another, and if I average them out for total stimulus, it's a flat line. And we know we don't want flat lines. We want to give opportunities for people to adapt. So what I would say is, yeah, if I'm in a max strength phase and I'm lifting heavy on Monday on these days and slightly lower but still relatively high on these days, that's my lift. Then perhaps my ESD is non-existent on a couple days. You don't always have to do both. And when I do it, I'm actually going to come in at red zone high intensity so that these lines match each other. Sort of a high-low method, if you will. Now, that being said, you have to be smart about modality and impact. I'm not going to have someone squat heavy, then go do sprints outside and be in a position where they're likely to pull their hamstring off their pelvis. That's where I need to make use of bikes, maybe rowers, but I still don't like that constant flexion. Versa climbers, if you have them, where we have that cyclic concentric only, where I can say, listen, we're going to put in an 8-minute dense packed red zone. We've got to find the energy, but we're not at an increased injury risk. So I don't know if that answered. There's a lot to consider. That's a whole piece. Whoever sent that, shoot me an email if you want to talk more about it. That's a great question.
So next one, you mentioned it, having a drop-in in a class. You know, how could you take those concepts that you talked about of, you know, interval length, density, those types of things to allow for kind of the newbie to come in without feeling chastised or kind of put on an island on their own?
Sure. I think the biggest piece is remembering self-pacing strategies. So if they don't want to be on an island by themselves, that's fine. But the language we use, right? Colin's been training with me for a while. So I'm like, hey, you've got to leave it all on the floor today. Like, and if you're quantifying, that's even better. Hey, last week on this workout, you achieved X feet on the Versa climber, X meters on the rower, X miles on the bike. Try and beat that. My language is giving a goal. My language is really encouraging Colin. But then someone comes in that's new. I'm just going to say, hey, you're new to the class, try it out. You're not going to want to come back if after the first class it's so hard, you're just destroyed for the next few days. We're all about building you up, not breaking you down. And the people you see here that are working really hard have been with me consistently. So you can see where you can be in time. You're going to go through the same intervals as everyone else. You're going to do the same workout. But I want you for today to simply think about familiarizing yourself with the class format and the movements. Take your time, move through them. And I'll make sure that I spend more time focusing on you, and I'll coach you up on the movements, and we can talk after if you want. And don't worry, everyone in this class at some point is where you are standing now, and you can see where you're headed. So something that's motivational in nature that doesn't chastise them, but leverages the self-pacing strategies and gives them permission to do that so they aren't breaking themselves off. Then you need to act on it and remind them. So if you see them going to a place that is poor movement mechanics, or they're clearly just crushing themselves, put them in check low and say, hey, just slow down, right? Like just get a feel for it and work through that way. So I would say self-pacing strategies is the best thing to account for how I can still have progressions in my classes, and a sort of cyclic progression, right, through phases, and have goals. And if someone gets dropped in at a super hard time in the class, self-pacing strategies is what makes that happen. Again, I really want to emphasize this. I get the real world challenge of having people starting and stopping programs at random times. I get what you guys struggle with, but it's not an excuse to therefore not pay attention to anything to do with progression or programming elements, okay? So we still want to do them, but just know that perfect is the enemy of good enough.
So there were a couple questions surrounding rest. So one, when you say off, does it mean completely off, like resting, standing still, lighter work? And then two, a couple concepts around, wow, that actually seems like a lot of rest that we're prescribing. And I know maybe that kind of could tie into some of the discussion that you and I had when going through this about what truly is a red zone, what is a green zone, why is there so much rest built in, what is the effort level in the work interval?
So if I want to consider intensity and duration, I need to remember the goal. A HIT class, high intensity interval training. 30 on, 30 off for the full 30 minutes, people are going to self-strategy. They're going to pace down, and it's not high intensity, right? It may feel like it to them, and you might have loud music going, but it's not maximizing their intensity. Giving structured breaks, but teaching them why and making sure that they bring more to those sessions is far more intense than anything else. So if I'm asking someone to truly work as hard as they can, I need to give them rest. We can look at substrate, and I see it's top of the hour. If you need to jump, but some good conversations here. I want to get through questions. So I'm going to keep rolling, and we will have this recording posted. Check out the Continuous Improvement Hub if you haven't done it yet for future webinars. Check out Yearly next week, and next month, and we are going to be getting to all the webinars being on Club Connect. So if you need to jump, and you can check out the recording on Club Connect, hopefully as soon as next week. But to get back to my answer there, if I go even on a red zone, right, like 10 seconds on, 50 seconds off, we'd say energy systems. You notice I didn't talk about energy systems. Again, you don't need to know Krebs cycle to be able to look at intensity and duration. But if we do, it actually becomes a bit problematic, because people would say that's ATP CP, 10 seconds of work, ATP CP. Well, what we need to remember, and there's a great book, Atco Viru, Training, Adaptation, and Sport. What we need to remember is I don't get my ATP and my CP stores back like that. So now all of a sudden, it takes me 1 to 2 minutes to get back to 70% of ATP. And it takes me another about 4 minutes to get back to full. And with that CP, that creatine phosphate, it takes me up to 7 minutes to get back to 100%. 2 to 4 minutes is 70%, about 7 minutes is 100%. That's why if you're truly working energy systems, that's not ESD, that's not energy systems development or conditioning or cardio or whatever you want to say. That's track practice. That's why if any of you come from a track background, if I'm actually working on block starts, I'm going to hit a 60-meter start or whatever distance. I hit my start, I hit my sprint, then I go rest for 7 to 8 minutes before I do another one. That's not what we're trying to do in our classes. The point there, though, is if I do want to be challenging greens and reds, that is to challenge my metabolic infrastructure, meaning getting up into my ceiling, my attic, getting at threshold or above. And if I don't give rest throughout, or I don't give enough rest, everyone self-paces into this nice little aerobic place where they're comfortable and it's sustainable. So if we want to truly drive them up, we've got to let them come back down. Drive them up, come back down. As far as it active rest or passive rest, depends on what you're trying to achieve, what the modality is, what the intensity is. If I'm looking at a true all-out, holy smokes, that was everything I've got, then I'm not going to ask them to keep continually to move. I'm going to give them more of a passive rest. Now, not sit down, let lactate accumulate and feel horrible, but not ask them to stay on that VersaClimber, that road, like let them get up, walk around, but truly have rest. If I'm doing some of these longer movements, like some of these later green zones, that rest can be an active rest. And that's up to you in programming how you want it. But I encourage you to use water breaks. It gives you an opportunity to coach, correct people's movements. Hey, in round 1 of the circuit, I saw a lot of this happening in the squat, so I want to see this on the next round, whatever it may be. It gives you a chance to coach, and people will get more out of it by having an opportunity to rest. Remember, what feels harder is not always actually giving you a better adaptation. You want intensity, you've got to give them a chance to rest.
The last one that we got here, and I think it's kind of to do with heart rate, of like, how do you find zones for people? And I'm assuming probably look at RPE, right?
Yeah, I'm using mostly RPE with a large group setting. Absolutely, heart rate's phenomenal. And when I've been working in some performance settings or with some of the military guys, of course, we utilize heart rate, we utilize power output, we utilize max aerobic speed, learn, design, deliver. Learning is about evaluation. I'm absolutely going to learn and evaluate a person first. If you're talking about a class environment, it's likely going to be more learning about how they move, learning about their goals, learning about those things, and less maybe having an opportunity for evaluation when they first come in. That's going to vary site by site. But if you are looking to use heart rate, because it's a variable, then we would want some sort of a graded exercise test that gets you up above threshold and identifies threshold somehow. Anything from metabolic cart down through indirect with like an iMed or a New Leaf or a CosMed, down through using a 7 out of 10 RPE, which is what we use on our ESD technology, right? So something that identifies an approximate threshold, and then something gets to it near max. Okay, so if I get them up near max, now I know what approximate max heart rate is, tested, not using 220 minus your age, but what close to their max is. I know what their threshold heart rate was, and I now prescribe zones off of that. The exact percentages are in XPS, I think XFS as well. You can go back and review, but just very quickly, your green zone is 100 to 110% of what your heart rate or power output was at threshold. Your red zone is 111% to max, and your yellow zone is 85 to 95% of what your heart rate was at threshold. So not 85, 95% max heart rate, 85, 95% of what it was at threshold. And that's how we operate based on heart rate if you're in a setting that allows for that.
Looks like one more came in, more of a sports-specific question here. So for in-season athletes or in-season training for athletes, is that kind of a contraindication for using ESD training since they're getting so much of it through their sports-specific work? Does it depend on the sport?
Yeah,
I mean, again,
great.
I think that's pretty...
Great question. Sport-specific, in-season, how does ESD play in? A couple things. One, it really depends on practice and what their game and practice schedule are like. This is where if you're working with a coach and you can influence work to rest ratios and sizes for small-sided games. So now their small-sided games and their drills, their technical and tactical work starts to overlay with you of what you're looking at from a practice and an adaptation standpoint. That's fantastic. That's a win if you're able to do that. But you need to look at what they're currently getting. And if there is room for extra, you don't want to give them more of the same. So this is one of the traps people fall into. So I talked about the speed power profile. Well, if we sort of look here at our 3 different zones of intensity, and this is sort of that max sprint repeat, and this is getting to be around threshold, and this is getting to be endurance or recovery. You need to identify where in their sport they're spending most of their time. People in sport specificity, they make the mistake of trying to mimic the sport too much. Remember, over specificity leads to lack of adaptation. If everything they're doing in their sport, whatever sport they have, let's say they're living right here, and all their practices and everything has them having a lot of these kinds of intervals when you assess what they're doing in their games, if you assess their sport, then it's actually our job to build up this and this, to actually do the opposite. Because if I just give them more of that, we're leaving money on the table. So sport specificity is almost looking at actual percentage of time at maximal sprints, looking at your zones. If you're on a soccer team, let's say, and you're utilizing GPS data, looking at the tracking for games, and if it's used in practice, looking at the data from that, and not trying to use the data to say that your training should now further mimic that, but actually saying, let's look at what's missing or lacking, if anything, and then you make the decision as to whether it fits in your program or not.
There are some other questions, but I think for time, we'll cut off the recording here. If you have further questions, send them to... Yeah,
so if we didn't get to your question, we're over on time, and I love that we had that much conversation. I mean, we've been going 17 minutes now on just questions. Please, if your question can get answered, shoot me an email, either sunderwood@teamexos.com or continuousimprovement@teamexos.com. Let's get some dialogue going. I love this topic. I hope I gave you a couple strategies to make this more applicable and to start applying our systems of greens, reds, and yellows and feel comfortable doing so in everything from a private training, personal training, all the way up to a class or group setting. And a few things to think about. To remember, perfect is the enemy of good enough. You don't need to get to the world's best ESD program, but don't fall in the habit of doing the same thing every day, and don't fall in the habit of not paying attention to what you're actually prescribing for intensity and duration. Make sure you're getting out of that ESD session what you want, so you have better performance outcomes for your clients. We'll end there. Again, Jair Lee next month on introduction to plyos and how they do apply to Gen Pop. Check out the Continuous Improvement Hub. Please start going there. I want to start getting more there. We've got discounts there. I'm going to start putting more content up there. I want it to become common practice that we go there, create a dialogue. Email me with anything. And remember, please help us get better. You're going to get a link in a survey on an email out of this. Please take the time to fill out the survey. It takes 2 minutes. Even if it's getting old because it's the same survey every time, it helps me to figure out what webinars were good and which webinars weren't, and start figuring out more of what you want. So that's everything we've got for today. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for doing what you do every day. And we'll see you next month with Jair Lee.